Now, if you go to many restrooms in the United States and other parts of the Western world, you may know which bathroom to use based on which of these figures might appear on the door. And it goes without explanation. Of course, these figures are designed this way based on the traditional clothing that men and women might wear. Nowadays, women are less likely to wear dresses than they used to be, certainly when these designs were created. But they're still there. And again, there's this idea that there's a dichotomy between male and female. Even more striking are these classic symbols, which on the left we have the symbol for women, but also, or the female, but also is the symbol for the planet Venus. Venus, the Roman goddess of love, and the figure itself depicts a mirror that a woman would be using, say, to apply her makeup. The figure on the right is the male symbol, which represents the planet Mars, who's the Roman god of war. And you have a shield with a spear, already sort of dichotomizing males and females, as females associated with love and with beauty, males associated with war and with violence. Again, these are stereotypes, but still they're there in these very symbols. Now, the question that's addressed here early on in the chapter is whether men and women reason about ethics differently. And a lot of this came from research. The original research was by a man named Kohlberg, who studied development in children and used examples for moral reasoning. And this research was challenged later by a woman named Carol Gilligan, another psychology professor, who thought that there was a gender bias in the research. And one thing that's interesting is that if you look on page 102, there's these lists of male and female qualities to reasoning about ethics. And if you notice on the male side, a lot of these are the very ones we've seen in the theories we've looked at previously, especially the Kantian and utilitarian and social contract type of ways of reasoning about ethics. They're impersonal, so impartial, public, contractual, based on reason, universal rules and rights, individual autonomy, And so you see all these features, again, which are associated with ethical theory per se. Of course, if we remember from our text, these ethical theories were all developed by men, and they were certainly in a context that's kind of legalistic, that's thinking about ethics very similarly to the way we think about law. Where if you look at the left column, you see the female perspective. You see that it's very much a situational type of ethics and based on relationships between individuals rather than abstract rules and laws. So it's personal, it's private, it's based on feeling. There's compassion, responsibility towards individuals, the relationship and the solidarity, the joining together rather than the focus on freedom and the individual. Now, the question is whether men and women actually think differently about ethics in general, or whether these are just reinforcing certain stereotypes that are already there. But this view led to some philosophers developing what's known as care ethics, alternatively ethics of care. And the idea is that while these so-called male ethical perspectives leave out a lot of what it means to be a human being living in the world and having relationships with other people, and that the female ethical perspective or care perspective is a much more down-to-earth, integrated way of thinking about ethics. That when we are making ethical decisions, a lot of times we're not thinking about abstract rules and contracts and using reason and thinking about universal human rights and things like that. We're thinking more about our relationship with this person, how we can help them, who else is involved in the situation, how they might be helped or harmed by what's going on. So that's the basic idea. So you don't really get a theory of ethics, because it may be the case that having a theory of ethics itself is a male way of thinking about ethics, whereas the female way is non-theoretical in a way, given that it's not based in reason per se, but in feeling and in human relationships. Now, the question is there a gender difference in morality? And that's an empirical question. research maybe could go one way or the other. This is not a class in psychology to see whether that's true, but it's unclear. But it seems like a lot of men might think in ways that are similar to the care ethics way of thinking, and a lot of women would think in the other direction. So it's not necessarily associated with males and females as much as just with different ways of thinking about ethics. The question is asked, if there is such a difference, what would explain it? And I'll allow you to read the text to decide what you think about that. Next, we think about feminism here as we leave care ethics behind for a little bit. But feminism sometimes gets a reputation, and that's because people often associated the term with radical feminism. And here's a symbol that would exemplify that. You have the female Venus symbol, but incorporated in that is a symbol that comes from the Black Power movement, which was a civil rights movement and a radical movement, as it were. It's not mainstream, that's all that means. But really, feminism, as it's defined in our text, is an intellectual commitment and a political movement that seeks justice for women and the end of sexism in all forms. You don't have to be a radical to get on board with this movement. And you can see, if you know a little bit about history in the Western world, you know that there's been a gradual movement towards more and more justice and the end of sexism. You know, women got the right to vote at the early part of the last century. You have sexual harassment laws to protect women in the workplace. You have movements toward equal pay for equal work. Various other sorts of things to try to get the end of sexism and justice for women. Now, a lot of parts of the world, there's still this very strong patriarchy where women are subjugated, and feminism would seek to rectify that to where women would be equal to men, at least under the law. Now, feminism, a lot of feminists don't like the care ethics approach. If we come to that, we can come to evaluating it. And they say, well, it's just reinforcing stereotypes about women. And the reason that women think this way about ethics, or maybe tend to think this way about ethics, is because of the position in society they've been put in. They have not been in positions of authority. They've been left to care for the home, whereas men are out in the world dealing in the public sphere, where you would have these abstract universal rules type of way of thinking, as opposed to in the home. I'll leave it to you guys to decide whether you think there are male and female ways of approaching ethics. I think it is interesting to think about when you look at a particular case or issue, whether you would apply one way of thinking or the other way of thinking, if you would come to different conclusions, if you thought about an ethical issue in a more personal way, as if it were part of your own life, as opposed to thinking about it as an abstract problem, say, in a legalistic way of thinking about things, and try to solve it that way. Okay, so that concludes our mini lecture on feminist thought and the ethics of care.